Welcome to the Trinities podcast, where we explore theories about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Episode 35, interview with Dr. Bart Ehrman about his book, How Jesus Became God. Dr. Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. A best-selling author, his more recent books include Misquoting Jesus, Jesus Interrupted, Did Jesus Exist?, Forgery and Counterforgery, and The Other Gospels. Welcome to the Trinities podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Ehrman is here today to talk to us about his book, How Jesus Became God, the Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. Dr. Ehrman, I just wanted to ask you about some of the more controversial theses that you argue for in this book. Even though the Gospels we have present Jesus as referring to himself as the, quote, Son of Man, in your view, the historical Jesus actually thought the Son of Man was someone else. Why do you think that?
The sayings of Jesus about the Son of Man in the New Testament are complicated and confusing. There are scholars who have written entire books, very fat books, just on what it is Jesus was talking about when he referred to the Son of Man. So my view is not a novel view that I came up with. It's one of the standard views. So when Jesus talks about the Son of Man, sometimes he does talk about himself. When he says, for example, the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and be rejected by the scribes and elders and be crucified and then raised from the dead, he's obviously talking about himself. There are other sayings in which Jesus talks about the Son of Man where if you didn't think already that he was the Son of Man, you wouldn't think that he was talking about himself. For example, in Mark 8:38, when he says, "Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this sinful and adulterous generation, of that person the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes on the clouds of heaven in the presence of the holy angels." In that saying, unless you already thought Jesus was talking about himself, it seems like he's talking about a different person. So scholars have to debate, did Jesus say all of these Son of Man things, or did he say some of them? If he said some of them, which ones did he say? And my view is that the early Christians who were sometimes making up sayings and putting them on Jesus' lips would not have made up a saying in which Jesus seemed to differentiate between himself and the Son of Man. So those sayings where that differentiation appears to be made are not ones that anybody made up. Those are the ones that go back to Jesus. And so Jesus was talking about a Son of Man who would be coming on the clouds of heaven in judgment over the earth as a kind of apocalyptic judgment from God.
Then it's based on separating the genuine reports, which are just about the Son of Man, from the later inferences where people, you think, later connected Jesus with the Son of Man.
Yeah,
is that right?
After the followers of Jesus came to think that he was raised from the dead, they thought that he was up in heaven now, and they thought he was the one coming back from heaven. And so when they told stories about Jesus, they had him refer to himself as this person they thought he was, namely the Son of Man.
You say that you changed your mind about whether or not we should trust the Gospels' reports of an empty tomb on the Sunday following the Friday that Jesus was killed. Why did you change your mind? After all, both Mark and John tell us the guy's name who donated the tomb.
Yes, indeed. Joseph of Arimathea. It's firmly established in those later traditions. For years and years, since forever, I thought that Jesus' tomb was found empty on the third day. I thought that, of course, when I was a Christian, but I also thought that when I was an agnostic, and I just thought that historians had to come up with some explanation for why the tomb was empty. I decided to do a little research, though, into the question of what Roman practices of burial were for people who were executed. Specifically, what was Roman procedure when it came to crucified people? And to my surprise, I saw, when I looked up every reference I could find in every ancient source, that the typical practice of Romans was not to allow a person to have a decent burial, but to leave the person on the cross after death so that the body would decompose and would be attacked by scavengers. You find reference after reference to this in ancient sources. What you don't find is any reference to Romans allowing people to be given a decent burial. And the reason is because the punishment of crucifixion was not simply that it was a torturous, slow death, but also part of the punishment was the humiliation that was invoked on the body after the death. That's normally what Romans did, and so the question is, did they do something different in the case of Jesus? I looked at every possible explanation for why Jesus would have been different from anyone else, and I simply couldn't find any explanation for why Romans wouldn't follow their standard procedure. The Christians who told the stories about Jesus' death, of course, they themselves had very good reason for wanting Jesus to be buried in a known tomb, because they wanted to be able to say that the tomb was empty. But historically, that looks problematic to me. So my best guess now is that Jesus was treated like everyone else and wasn't given a decent burial.
That kind of treatment seems like sort of the ultimate insult, right?
Yes.
We're going to let your body out to rot. The one thing you can do beyond killing somebody is, disgrace their body. I mean, could it just be the Romans didn't hate him that much, that they almost in some sense reluctantly crucified him, as the gospel sometimes portray it?
When you read the Gospels, it's pretty interesting, because if you arrange the Gospels chronologically, so the earliest first and then the next and then the latest, the Romans become more and more reluctant with the passing of time through the Gospels. So in the Gospel of Mark, Pilate doesn't show very much reluctance at all. In the Gospel of Luke, which is written later, Pilate actually declares Jesus innocent 3 times, which you don't find in Mark. In the Gospel of Matthew, Pilate calls for water and washes his hands and says, "I'm innocent of this man's blood." And the crowds cry out, "His blood be upon us and our children." In the Gospel of John, it actually says in the Greek that the chief priests stirred up the crowds against Jesus. They cried out for him to be crucified, and Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So that in John, it's not even the Romans doing it. As you go on later into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Pilate becomes exonerated so much that there are traditions that Pilate actually converted and became a Christian. So that in some texts, such as in Ethiopia and in Egypt, Pilate was portrayed as a Christian saint. So you wonder, well, what's going on with this exoneration of Pilate? Well, what's going on is that as time goes on, Pilate gets more innocent precisely because that places all the guilt on the Jews. So this idea that Pilate reluctantly executed Jesus, I don't think is borne out by the historical evidence. I think Pilate considered Jesus a troublemaker, and he ordered him crucified. Pilate didn't want to humiliate Jesus. He wouldn't have had him crucified. He could have had him beheaded or killed some other way. Crucifixion was reserved for people that you really wanted to get even with.
Another surprising claim you make in the book is that, in Paul's view, Jesus, before becoming a man, was an angel. You base this on Galatians 4:14, where Paul says to the church, "You received me as an angel of God, as Jesus Christ." I wonder, though, isn't there an upward motion here? Paul's grateful that he was welcomed as if he were not just an eminent person, but even as if he were an angel, and even as if he were someone greater, namely Christ.
Yeah, that's how I always read it, too. For years, that's what I thought it meant, until I started reading around in studies of Paul's Christology, Paul's understanding of Jesus. There are several books that are written on Paul's angel Christology, written by, the books that I know about are written by people who are committed to the Christian faith themselves. And it turns out this understanding that I used to have, and the one that you just explained, doesn't appear to be right. And the reason it doesn't appear to be right is because this particular construction in Paul, the grammatical construction in Paul, where something is as that, even as that. So you received me as this, even as an angel. Paul has that grammatical construction elsewhere. For example, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1, where Paul says, "I could not speak to you as spiritual people, but rather as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ." Well, the as is not an increase; it's actually a restatement of the previous claim, and so that's going on in Galatians 4:14. Receive me as an angel, even as Christ, doesn't mean that Christ is more than an angel. It means that Christ is an angel. Once you understand that Christ is an angelic being in Paul, then everything else falls in place about Paul's understanding of Christ, including, as I point out in the book, this very famous passage in Philippians chapter 2, where Christ is a pre-existent divine being who, after his crucifixion, is elevated to an even higher status before God.
In your view, as time went on, the point at which Jesus was considered a divine Son of God was pushed back further in time. Could you briefly explain that for us?
Yeah, this is, again, not an idea I came up with. I first ran across this idea in the writings of Raymond Brown, who was one of the most famous New Testament scholars at the end of the 20th century. He was a Roman Catholic priest, but he was a very famous New Testament scholar, and justly so. He was absolutely one of the best interpreters of the Bible that America has produced. Brown argued that if you arrange the Gospels in chronological sequence, with Mark, our earliest Gospel, first, then Matthew and Luke, and then John, you can trace the Christological conception through them, so that in the Gospel of Mark, the key moment for Jesus as the Christ is at his baptism, where the voice from heaven declares, "You are my son, in you I am well pleased." In Matthew and Luke, the key moment is Jesus' birth. Unlike Mark, they have a virgin birth narrative. And so in Luke, for example, Jesus is called the Son of God precisely because God is the one who makes Mary pregnant, as it states in Luke chapter 1, verse 35. The Gospel of John, our last Gospel, doesn't see Jesus as becoming the Son of God at either the baptism or his birth, but actually that he's always been the Son of God from eternity past. And so in John you have, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that chronologically you can trace the development of Christology through the Gospels of the New Testament. So this is Raymond Brown's idea, and in fact I think that it's absolutely right.
I wonder if it's more a shift of language than actually a significant shift in Christology. I mean, imagine that you think that Jesus is predestined to be the fully exalted Messiah. So then even before his birth, even maybe before he exists, he's still going to be predestined. And then as soon as he exists, whenever that is, whether in eternity or at the moment of conception, he's going to be destined. So he's going to be, a potential full-on Son of God. But if you think that, I wonder if it matters then really, kind of what point you choose to focus on.
Well, I would say my view is that that's presupposing the conclusion. It's the question of whether Mark understands Jesus to be a pre-existent Son of God or not. So you can't presuppose that he thinks that and then explain away the baptism scene. You have to read Mark and ask, does Mark presuppose a pre-existent being Christ, or does Matthew, or does Luke? And I think if you just interpret these texts without a theological assumption about what they must have believed, you won't come away thinking that they understand Christ to be a pre-existent being.
Actually, I'm granting that. I'm granting that he doesn't pre-exist according to any of the synoptics. That's actually my view. But my point is, here's 3 times at his exaltation, at his baptism, and at his conception. But if you think he's destined all along to be the Christ, I mean, it's just one smooth motion from potential to actual, right? And then at what time you choose to dub him the Son of God seems to be a matter of convention.
Well, the reason it matters is because, I think the reason it mattered to the early Christians was that the earliest Christians were saying that Jesus became the Son of God at his resurrection. And later Christians said, no, it must have been the Son of God for his entire ministry. So it's at the outset of his ministry, at the baptism, that he became the Son of God. And then they thought about it more, and they said, well, it wasn't just during his ministry, it was during his entire life. And so it's at his birth that he becomes the Son of God. And then they thought about it more, and they said, actually, it's not just his earthly life. He's always been the Son of God, and so he's a pre-existent being. So I think it mattered to the early Christians when this happened. And you can see different views about that in different ones of the Gospels.
You think it matters because they went from a non-pre-existence view to a pre-existence view?
Well, I think the pre-existence is the view they ended up with. But I think that the people who believed that Jesus became the Son of God at his conception or his birth really disagreed with the Christians who were saying that Jesus became the Son of God at his resurrection. I think this was a big deal for them, and that it really did matter when this big event happened.
Dr. Ehrman, your evangelical critics in the book How God Became Jesus frequently echo the work of Richard Bauckham, who argues that all the New Testament writings present Jesus as, quote, belonging to the identity of the one God, end quote. In their view, this shows that the highest possible Christology is right in all of the New Testament books, and so then there's no room for the sort of evolving Christology that you are theorizing about as a historian in this book. What do you make of Professor Bauckham's thesis?
I would say that prophets belong to the identity of God and share in the identity because they have the Word of God. So it doesn't make Jesus God. They're very slippery in that book. For example, Mike Bird wants to argue that Jesus considered himself God, but he he never comes out and says that Jesus said things like you find in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says things like, I and the Father are one, or before Abraham was, I am, or if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. There are sayings of Jesus in the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, where Jesus clearly identifies himself as God. And what I argue in my book is that these sayings are distinctive of the Gospel of John, our last Gospel, but they're not the sorts of things that Jesus said about himself. The historical Jesus didn't go around calling himself God. If he had, you'd have reports of that in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who don't say anything at all about that. But it's just inconceivable to me that Jesus really was calling himself God, and these gospel writers decided not to mention that part. It would be the most important thing to mention. So in the book, How God Became Jesus, Michael Bird wants to argue that Jesus does present himself as being a representative of God on earth, but he uses very slippery language to explain that. He never comes out and says that Jesus actually said these things that John says that he said, and he doesn't come out and say exactly what Jesus did say about himself, other than he is a representative of God on earth. And that's true. Jesus certainly did think he was the representative of God on earth. And Isaiah thought that about himself, and Amos thought that about himself, and Jeremiah thought that about himself. That just means he's a prophet. It doesn't make him God.
So it seems like the virtue of this new language that Jesus belongs to the identity of God is that it seems to suggest that Jesus is God himself, but also not, right?
Well,
because he belongs to it.
It allows them to suggest that he's God without, him ever saying so. And so belonging to the identity of God certainly isn't anything like what the New Testament says about Jesus. You won't find a verse that talks about Jesus belonging to the identity of God. It's a very slippery concept that they throw out there because it opens up the possibility of seeing Jesus as divine, even if he never said that about himself.
And it's interesting that it's different than the traditional Catholic strategy of arguing that surely there's a divine nature on display here in his actions.
It's a very different, it's a very Protestant way of doing it, absolutely.
I think they kind of realize that 4th century set of conceptions doesn't really belong in the 1st century Gospels. And so I think that's, and also it's difficult, and it's interesting this has just come up.
Yeah, but I think that's an excellent point, because they agree, they don't ever come out and say this, but they agree that in fact the 4th century understanding of Christ is not the view that you get in the New Testament. But since they agree that that's the case, they also agree that there is a development of Christological thought through the centuries. The disappointing thing about their book, How God Became Jesus, is they think that there's a development, but they never explain how the development happened. There's no narrative that they give to explain how you get from the 1st century to the 4th century. And what my book is all about is the development and the narrative of how it happened. So it's one thing to take pot shots at what I have to say about this, that, or the other point, but it's another thing to come up with a plausible scenario of your own. And so I really wish they had come up with some kind of scenario so we could actually evaluate the merits of the two.
Well, the way they seem to think about it is that all the New Testament and all the Gospels really did logically imply that Jesus is divine in the strongest sense, and that somehow, it took centuries for these implications to be noticed, or at least for language to be developed to express them, something like that. But, logical implications are what's immediately understood by someone who understands you, so that's not a plausible story.
No, it's not very plausible at all, in my opinion. And, to say that it's implied, why isn't it stated? Christians today don't go around implying that Jesus is God. They say he's God.
What the synoptics emphatically state is that Jesus is the Son of God, and it's clear that God is someone else.
Yeah, well, that's right. And, I think the synoptics do understand Jesus to be God, but what I emphasize in my book is that if somebody says Jesus is God, you have to ask, in what sense is he God? Because ancient people didn't have our sense that something was either divine or he was not divine. There are all sorts of levels of divinity for Greek thinkers, Roman thinkers, for Jewish thinkers. And so to say Jesus is the Son of God isn't the same thing as saying, for example, that he's equal with God or that he is God the Father. Those are all different things.
Yes, that's something I wanted to talk to you more about. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you online at trinities.org.